All right, well, welcome to PSL Demo Day. I'm really pleased to have Kevin Perese and Dorian Carloni, both from the Congressional Budget Office, with us here today. They're going to split this presentation, and Kevin's going to start talking about transparency efforts at CBO and what they've done to open source some of their work. And then Dorian is going to present on a particular model that they've made open source, their capital taxation model. So with that, Kevin, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure to share this work with you all. I've been following the work of the Open Source Policy Center and the PSL models for quite some time. I'm a big fan, and I know that they're equally a big fan of the work that CBO does. And yeah, we're really pleased to be here and share this work with you all. So I want to start off with this picture. This is someone that maybe some of you know. I don't know how into your budget and economic history you are. This is a picture of Alice Rivlin. She was the first director of CBO, and she was the director there from like 1975 through 1983. And she wrote a memo to staff in 1975, of which this is a segment, an excerpt from, where she really clearly lays out her vision for how CBO should operate in a transparent and accessible way, and that we should aim to make our writing as clear and accessible to a broad audience as possible, as broad an audience as possible. And the ethos of this kind of openness and accessibility and clarity still permeates the work to this day, some 48 years later after the founding of CBO. And it's really a core principle at CBO, so much so that we have an entire page dedicated to our transparency efforts at CBO. This is right in under the cbo.gov about and then /transparency. As you can see, the goal is to provide equal and open access to our work. And there's a couple more bullet points that are mentioned in this slide that I want to just focus on here, that we have three primary goals in our transparency efforts. And this is to promote thorough understanding through that, clarity in our communication style. And then it's also to provide folks with some sort of estimates and engage the sensitivities of the analyses that we do when that's possible. And then finally, it is to enhance the credibility of the agency through sharing as much data and analysis components and code as possible. And so I'm going to try and quickly go through these three little goals and show you some of our recent, release of our work on that are aligned to those goals. So every year, for the past several years now, we've been putting out a report that is dedicated to our transparency efforts, and we just released this last one in March with a review of what we've released and some plans for what we're planning to release. Some of those details of what we've actually done, I'm going to share with you. Just in April, we put out two primers on how the CBO develops its budget baseline, and then also how it describes its cost estimating process. These two pieces of the work at CBO are really kind of core to the bread and butter of our mission, and our work is to provide the Congress with a baseline every year or multiple times per year, and then use that as a benchmark for which we analyze proposed legislation and produce cost estimates relative to that baseline. And then following up on those two primers that were released in April, we released three more primers related to a budget process on explaining how how we estimate savings from rescissions, and then some of the statutory foundations of the budget baseline, the production of the budget baseline, and then finally some of the principles that we use for identifying mandates and legislation. Lest you think this trend is going to continue in some sort of linear or Fibonacci-like sequence, we're not planning on releasing 4 or 5 more primers in June, but this is just a smattering of how we're trying to be as transparent in our communication and release information to everyone about how CBO operates and what our core principles are, what our core business practices are, and what, to share that with folks in as transparent a way as possible. One of the things that we produce on a regular basis is this kind of nice-ish, I think very nice interactive graphic of showing the big picture of the federal budget. and it shows you kind of clearly what the segments of the budget are in terms of mandatory versus discretionary and interest outlays. And you can, hover over these. And if you scroll through this page, there's lots of trends over time of the deficits and the debt. And it's a really nice kind of transparent and easily accessible way to quickly get a big picture overview of the federal budget. I think it's a really nice graphic in doing so to explain the concepts in a nice way. Similarly, we have a couple of other interactive graphics that I'd like to highlight for folks. This is an interactive tool for the force structure of our national defense. And you can go through and click on all these little tabs here, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and defense-wide, and make changes to the force structure of the U.S. Army and the Navy and the Air Force, and see how that affects our federal budget and what the costs are for each of those components and how they interact and the like. Similar to that, we have an interactive tool that is kind of shows different policy options or potential implementation details of changing the minimum wage. This is a really nice and detail-oriented set of interactive graphics where a user can play with a bunch of policy parameters and get a sense of what CBO's underlying model of analyzing the minimum wage might, what some of the outputs and the effects of those would be if there were to be legislation that was similarly structured. And then moving into the next stage of like releasing our work in terms of data and code and transparency, trying to be transparent in kind of the to meet the goals of our increased credibility, and that we're showing our work and that we are, relying on a range of inputs. We share our analysis and our data as much as we possibly can. So we have an entire page devoted to the data that we release. And then we, they're organized by separate columns here of budget data and then economic data. And this is very hopefully cleanly organized and well accessible to folks to download our data and scrutinize it and use it for their own purposes as well. And then finally, the kind of the talk of today that we're going to focus on a bit is our more recent efforts to put our models out in the public domain in code and data format and documentation, all up on GitHub. We currently only have 4 models up on GitHub at the moment, but we're working to produce more and more. Prior to that, there's probably another half dozen or 10 or so models that we were releasing kind of as links to zip files that contain the data and the code together before we had our own CBO GitHub account set up. So this is one of our most recent releases, was just from a month or so ago, where we show an evaluation of our outlay projections and how they compare to historical actual outlays, what our projections compare to actuals look like. And then the model that we're going to talk about today is this model that we're calling our captax model, which is what the topic of the rest of the conversation will be. And I'm going to then pass over to Dorian for him to describe. So that was rather quick. I hope that gives you plenty of time, Dorian, to go through the rest of this.
All right, nice, Jason. Kevin, can I sneak a question in there?
Absolutely.
So the CBO GitHub account, I'm not even fazed by that because that happens every time I make a presentation.
Okay, that was a first for me, so that was fun.
Yeah, that was very tame compared to some of the previous ones. The GitHub, CBO GitHub account, do you guys have any, I mean, a lot of the models you have are proprietary. You've got the 4 open source ones. I think even having private repositories on GitHub for internal usage would be really nice for CBO. Do you guys use private repositories as well as public?
So not through GitHub explicitly. We've been using version control systems internally for a long time. We've been primarily using Subversion as our version control software solution. We still have a lot of our internal models that are under version control in SVN. we have a internal GitLab server that we use as well. So those are the kind of the three tools for managing our models that we're using. This public-facing GitHub page is a relatively new addition to that. I think that there's probably some concerns about like using the public-facing GitHub page for internal development, even private repos. But so we're primarily using GitLab as our internal solution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'll move on then to kind of describe what the captax model does and specifically how you can use it if you want to, for example, run alternative policies. I mean, the whole code base is now available on GitHub, so it is accessible for everyone to use. Next. So for those who are not familiar with the model, the main focus of the model is on how capital income from new investment is taxed by federal taxes. And this is a model that has a long history at CBO. It was initially developed in Excel, and it was released in 2006 along with a working paper. And after that, it was extended and it was converted into Fortran. And only recently, we put the effort to convert it into Python, and we released it last year along with an updated working paper, which you can also find on the CBO website. And the model is now publicly available. And our goal is to update at least the model parameters twice a year as we release the budget and economic outlook. And we've been doing that for the last 3 releases, and we're planning on doing that going forward. So the model is really focused on 2 measures of how taxes affect businesses and homeowners' decision on marginal investment. So the tax wedge and the effective marginal tax rate. So most of you are probably familiar with those concepts, but I'll just give you like a brief outline of what they are. So both of those combine 2 concepts. One is the required before tax rate of return on new investment. So this measure is analogous to the kind of the cost of capital measure that was defined in Holland and Jorgensen's seminal work on this. So this is a measure that basically captures the break-even rate of return that an investment has to earn in order to make it worth it. And you can think about it as, what you need to pay whoever is investing in an entity or business, for example, and after paying for taxes at that entity level, and after paying for depreciation. The tax wedge and the EMTR also have another component, which is the after-tax rate of return to savers. So you can think about that measure as capturing additional taxes on the savers level, as interest and dividends are paid, for example, to savers, to the additional layer of taxation that comes from individual income taxes. And so those 2 measures of taxation are basically combining taxes at the entity investor level and the savers level. One of the strengths, of the CBO model is that the framework can be used to estimate how those tax measures vary at a very disaggregated level. So across industries, asset types, legal forms, which are mainly C Corps, pass-throughs, and owner-occupied housing, and sources of financing, so namely equity and debt. So next. So although we have very detailed disaggregation, the ways in which we use the model require aggregation of those cells. And so we have two ways of doing that in the model. So we have the first perspective, which we call the comprehensive perspective, which is not isolating the effect of the tax system, is basically calculating these tax measures, accounting for differences in how different assets are taxed, but also accounting for how, for example, different industries or legal forms are invested. So the asset composition across industries, for example, can vary. And also, rates of return on different types of investment on equity versus debt can differ. And so this method takes that as a given. It doesn't correct for that. The second method is, the aim of it is to really isolate the effect of the tax system. And so we're trying to hold everything else equal. And so, correct some of the differences that arise from other channels and really focus on the tax system. So currently we use both of those in our analysis. Next. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we publish with every budget and economic outlook, we publish some supplemental tables. So currently, there are two that use the captax model, and I will describe those later. But we also have other uses of the model, policy-related uses, like to support the analysis of the president budget, but also to support specific analysis on legislation, or the analysis of the alternative fiscal scenarios, which are generally part of the long-term budget outlook. But also the model has been used for specific kind of non-recurring reports on issues that have to do with the taxation of capital income. And so those are just two that we've released in the past. Next. And so going back to the supplemental tables, so we currently release two tables. The first one is this table on effective marginal tax rates. And this one is using the comprehensive method. So it gives you a sense of how capital income is taxed throughout the budget window for different types of assets, sources of financing, and legal forms. Next. The second table we release is more focused on how the tax system treats different forms of investment. And this table shows tax wedges instead of effective marginal tax rates. So, for example, this table will show that C corporations are currently taxed more heavily than pass-through entities because the tax wedge is larger. Next. So that's a subset of the output that the model produces, but let's talk a bit about the components of the model. So there are many components. There's some parameters that define the economic environment. So some of those parameters are listed here, and those you can change as well. They're available on GitHub, and those values. Some of them receive a frequent update, like the inflation and the rates of return. Some others, are updated just once in a while, as new information becomes available. And then we have weights, which those are important in the aggregation because generally we don't use values from individual cells. We aggregate cells to broader aggregates, and so. You have, well, currently in the model, we're using fixed asset tables from BA. And so the weighting scheme is based on that, but potentially you can think about using alternative weights as you like. Perhaps, what's most interesting to you is the policy parameters. So the policy parameters can be changed as well, and this is kind of the main focus of this presentation. So there's a variety of parameters in the model that capture the US federal tax system. And maybe let's move to the next slide, and I can kind of So those are, I mean, I'm not going to talk about kind of each parameter individually, but this is kind of to give you a sense how most parameter values that fit into the model vary over the budget window. Most of them are estimated using publicly available information, and you can find the documentation behind those parameter estimates on the GitHub page. Some of those are estimated using our own internal modeling. So this is like the first set of parameters that fit into the model. So that includes, for example, tax rates on different legal forms, or deduction parameters. But you can find more information on each of those as you wander through the CBO GitHub page. So let's move on maybe to the next slide. There are then parameters that are not expressed as annual values, but you can see them here. They're rather suffixes to CSV files that are stored in kind of separate folders. And for those files, so those files are structured as asset by industry matrices generally, where each cell has a specific value, and you can then access those files and change one or more values in those files. But I'll explain exactly how you do that. So let's maybe move on to the next slide. So this is how you access the policy parameters in the model. So as you navigate through the GitHub page, you can go then to data inputs policy parameters, and that's where all the relevant information is. So this Excel file that you see here, the captax policy parameters.xlsx, is where the documentation is, or at least part of the documentation for how these policy parameters are calculated is. The main driver of the model is policies.yml, which is where you specify the CSV files that you want the model to run are located. So in the version that you see on GitHub, the model is run using current law parameters, and there's a separate file for each perspective. So we have one run using a CSV files that includes comprehensive perspective parameters, and then a second file where we have tax uniformity perspective parameters, and those are a little bit different. So maybe let's go to the next slide, and and the way you run the model is on the main page you have this run captax.py, and you run that file, and it runs the model for you. I'm not going to spend too much time, describing how you download the files into your computer and how you run things. I assume most people are familiar with that, but there is documentation on that as well on our website. So the rest of the presentation, I'm really going to talk about how you change the policy parameters. So maybe next slide. So there are really two types of changes you can implement using this model. So as I showed you earlier, most policy parameters are annual values, and those are relatively simple to change. But there is a subset that are not just annual values. They're suffixes that are basically linking you to separate CSV files that are stored in separate folders. And those are matrices that vary by industry and asset type. But let's maybe go on, and I can show you exactly what I mean. So simple policy change is very simple. The policy parameters are stored in this CSV file. This is the kind of the main policy parameter file. In this particular case, this is the file for current law parameters under the comprehensive perspective. And so you have all these parameters that are organized a little bit more nicely than how I showed you earlier. And you can just save a version or copy of this file under a different name in that same folder. So for example, you can call it policy parameters, my policy name comprehensive instead of current law. And then you can change whichever value you like, or set of values that you like. And so this is relatively simple to implement, and you can also, do this just for the comprehensive method. You don't need to make a symmetric change or an analogous change in the uniformity CSV file. So you can do that kind of in isolation for either of the two methods or both of the methods. So let's maybe move on to the next slide. The more complex policy change is a little bit more complex, but it's actually not that hard to implement either. So there are parameters that define depreciation adjustments, investment tax credit adjustments, and tax rate adjustments that are stored in CSV files and are located in these subfolders. So all the depreciation parameter files that have this kind of asset by industry matrices are in the depreciation adjustments folder. And so you can change any of those files that are in one of those folders. So for example, for depreciation adjustments, one of the parameters that goes into the calculation of tax depreciation is the acceleration rate. And so in the folder under current law, you'll find a file named acceleration rates CLaw perm, which just means that it's a current law, a set of parameters, and it's permanent. So it applies, even past 2033. And so you can basically access this file, and then you can change any of the values that are in this file. And you should save it then in a separate CSV file that you can call acceleration rates mypolicyname.csv, for example. So this is the first step of the more complex policy change. So let's move on to the next slide. The second step is kind of going back to that main file where kind of all the policy parameters are stored, which is the same file I showed you earlier when I was modifying a specific annual value. So some of these columns, as I showed you earlier, have suffixes. And so what you need to do is replace that CLaw perm for acceleration rates with your new suffix. So it would be my policy name in this case. And so once you have those two components done, you can, so let's maybe go to the next slide. Well, actually, maybe we should go back a couple of slides because let's go back another one. Yes, this one. So once you have those two steps done, all you need to do is specify the files, the CSV files with parameters that you want to run. And so you see at the bottom of this slide, you have, in this particular case, I specified policy parameters, my policy name comprehensive, but also the uniformity, the my policy name uniformity, which you don't have to do. Here you could have just the first line, and the model would just run as well. And so that would give you the output with kind of all the comprehensive perspective results with your new parameters, and you would store that output in a newly created output folder. So let's maybe go back to the output. So this is what the output looks like for the current law parameters. So whenever you're running the comprehensive perspective, you're gonna get a folder with all this output, which is generally in CSV format and organized in a tidy format. But there's one file in there that is an Excel file, which is basically the supplemental table that we release as part of the Outlook. So for the comprehensive method, you're going to have a supplemental table, the MTR's current law comprehensive. And this is exactly what you'll find on the CBO website. For the uniformity method, you're going to find a supplemental table, tax wedges current law uniformity. That's the second table I mentioned earlier. So of course, this is just a subset of the output that you could be producing. Because the model is able to produce information for each individual cell, you can also, aggregate that information as you'd like in different ways. So, you can just add to the code to produce a different set of outputs if you'd like. So this is the current law output. So whenever you have a new policy that you want to simulate, the model is going to create a new folder. Here, instead of current law, it's going to call it my policy name. And then it's going to create a subfolder called either comprehensive or uniformity, depending on what you're trying to do. And it's going to store the output in that subfolder. So you shouldn't need to create that, by hand before running the model. The model recognizes that, you might not have that folder on your computer, and as you run the code, it's going to create that for you. And so maybe next, I don't know if there's anything. Okay. So, this is, as I said, it's all publicly available. And so one of the goals of doing that is so that we could receive feedback from outsiders on, things we can improve on or even extensions of the model potentially. And so if you have any particular thoughts after you've had the time to go over the details of the model, definitely feel free to share with Kevin and I. But in the meantime, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Dorian, thank you so much for sharing that model. And Kevin, thanks as well for talking about CBO's efforts. And I know for a long time, CBO has been producing these reports that are very readable. And even for myself, I've used some of the Excel files that have been posted that Dorian referenced with the capital taxation model. And that was really the foundation to building the cost of capital calculator that's in the policy simulation libraries catalog. It was tremendous to see what you all are doing now and in just taking even further steps at transparency and making models such as this captax model where folks can not only see your methodology, but then build off of it to create their own simulation. So really wonderful to see. And now we can kind of open it up for questions if folks have them. As usual, I'll take my prerogative and ask the first. And I'll start with just a comment. I really like how you have the comprehensive and uniform perspectives in that captax model. It's something that it's kind of hard sometimes to do an apples to apples comparison in these models because industries have different mixes of assets which are really important in these calculations. And so to allow the user to very easily see both those perspectives is really helpful. But my first question revolves around kind of the policy parameterization and changing those for a simulation as you illustrated, Dorian. I like the CSV file format. Everything's very clear and human readable. Do you give instructions? Though some of these parameters are hard to create, like the marginal tax rate on pass-through income. It's not just the statutory individual rate, but there's the QBI deduction and so on. Do you have instructions or guides, or what do you expect users to do when updating some of these more complex parameters?
So is that a question for me or for Kevin? Because I have my own answer to it, but Kevin might.
No, please, Dorian. That's
okay.
All in your wheelhouse for sure.
So there is some documentation on the website. What our plan would be is to release a bit more of it. Like, a lot of the parameters, say, rely on BA data or publicly available SOI tables or Federal Reserve kind of financial accounts information, but a lot of the calculations are done in underlying Excel spreadsheets, which we have not released. And so part of what I'm doing now is trying to kind of translate that into Python code that then can be shared more broadly, so that people can see not just how the model works, but also how the calculation of the parameter is done. Of course, there is a subset of the parameters that rely on confidential data, and that that we couldn't disclose because it's just confidential.
Right, but we'll highlight which of those parameters come from our internal models that use confidential data and things like that, and it'll be up to end users to make their own decisions then about how to come up with their own estimates. And I mean, that's the great thing about this being out there, is that folks can play with it and simulate it and test it out and see what they think. But yeah, we're working on sharing as much of that preparation of the parameters as possible, and trying to automate and surface all those formulas out of the Excel spreadsheets and put them into nicely organized, well-documented Python code, and highlight what the input sources of data are through that process as well.
Okay, great. It's like Rick has his hand up. Rick. You're muted.
Sorry, I was looking at the repos. I love that these are out there. I love that demo that Dorian just gave. There aren't any pull requests. I mean, Kevin, you kind of said this, that most of the version control is happening internally at CBO. But if someone like me or anyone else on this call were interested in this model and submitted a pull request to the captax repository, is that something, I guess, is that direction of flow of information available right now to CBO? Because you could even put an issue up that says help wanted, and if you define it well enough, you could just any interested programmer on the planet could hop in and create something that works for CBO. So I'm really interested if you guys can take outside pull requests through this GitHub organization and your repositories.
So right, of the 4 repositories that we have up there, 3 of them are open, and folks are welcome to raise issues or pull requests. There's only one that is a archived repo. That was our initial one, and was done with some caution and dipping the toes in the water and seeing how this GitHub world works. And we're open to having these conversations with folks if they have inputs and suggestions. I think that towards the bottom of our README that we request folks to open an issue before submitting a pull request, and we can have a dialogue about what the concerns are, and then if there's a pull request, to close the issue related to it. And so yeah, I mean, we've not had any, and so I don't know, we don't know quite yet what the formal process would be for triaging them, but we're welcome to find out.
Great, Parker.
Hey, Kevin, you mentioned that you use GitLab as your internal solution, but then you're publishing repos on GitHub. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the factors that drove you to make that internal decision, and then how you manage having 2 different systems?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of things happen kind of organically, and that there's we've been using Subversion since 2005, I think, and the majority of our models are still in Subversion. And then it is kind of an interesting thing that Subversion and Git are both free and open source, but then there's actually a decent amount of expense associated with things like internal servers and collaboration frameworks to work in, like GitLab and GitHub Enterprise. And I think it mostly came down to pricing, to be quite honest. And We have a somewhat limited number of licenses for GitLab, but as we hire more and more folks who come into CBO with Git and GitHub experience and, wanting to use that in their daily workflows, we're going to be expanding the license seats for that. So yeah, it is. And then, there's a lot of, transition costs to consider in terms of folks' workflows and comforts with, work transitioning from SVN to Git, and then the licensing seats issue internally. So that's the history of the evolution of it all. It's still very much a work in progress, I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I have another question on this. I think CBO is really a leader in transparency and openness among government organizations. Do you have any, in your interactions with the other government organizations, do you see other groups following suit of what you all are doing? Because, I mean, we're talking about nitpicky little, I want to see this, I want to see this, but it's so great what CBO is doing. Who else is following you guys?
So I participate in a group of R users groups, like the interagency R users group and the R Govies group, and there are a bunch of folks from places like BLS and Census and FDA and NOAA Fisheries and NASA, and they're all trying to do similar things, and some of them are, I'd say, even further advanced than we are. Like NOAA Fisheries, like they've got almost all of their stuff out in the public. It's like there's I think a little bit more of a open science sort of framework that they're trying to follow, and that they have scientists that expect to do all their work in the public domain, and that is how they come on, and this is what they've been trained through their graduate programs in, and they've done a really great job of what is it? It's OpenScapes, I think, is a really great organization that's surrounded to doing open science, and that a lot of folks from Open Fisheries, NOAA Fisheries, NOAA Fisheries is working with. Kind of cool.
Any other in the econ space? I mean, I know Census and John Aboud have tried to do a lot there, and it feels like Chris Carroll tried to do some at Consumer, forget the CRF, no, what's the name of the
CFPB, Financial Protection Bureau.
Yes. Any other economics groups that that are following suit on this type of transparency?
I know that the folks at BLS are have a whole lot of training efforts and are working towards this type of open using, figuring out how to get open source software as their backbone for producing their data and their analyses, and to share it online as best as they can. So BLS is the folks that I'm most aware of, but I'm sure there are probably others that I'm not aware of. Perhaps EPA, yeah.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, let me thank you both again, Dorian and Kevin. Really appreciate your time today and love what you're doing at CBO. It's really good work, as we expect from CBO, but we love seeing it in the open source space. So thank you both so much for sharing it with us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having us. This is great.
Thank you, Jason.
Take care.
Bye all.
Bye.